I'm going to talk about affordable housing. You said that the word affordable housing has a negative connotation, so you prefer life cycle housing. Up in our neck of the woods, which is up in the northeast, density housing. Because my first question to you is, how are municipalities expected to meet their quote-unquote obligation, which is an obligation, without the land capacity to meet that obligation? There's no way. I live in Summit, which I also want to question you about, that you called it a hub for homelessness, which I was very curious about that. We have to have a conversation about that. Summit has 0.24% buildable land, yet has an obligation to build 345 affordable units. How do you expect these municipalities to construct this, however you want to call it, housing, with no buildable land?
So there is an affordable housing obligation, right, that's been dictated by the Mount Laurel decision. The calculations that we constructed were based on the statute. We had zero flexibility in coming up with what the criteria should be in evaluating that. Based on the criteria that was provided in the legislation, that's what the calculation showed. These were non-binding. So if a municipality
They were non-binding.
Correct. Non-binding. So if a municipality had questions, concerns, issues with it, they could, under the same formula that was provided in the criteria, provide what they believe is their obligation that they need to provide in affordable housing. There were certain things that the department just would never have access to. Some of the criteria that was told that we had to use were a lot of like aerial maps, some of the DEP mapping. We also were unaware, of course, if there were any projects that were already in the pipeline with certain communities across the state of New Jersey, which is why they were non-binding. So they were provided because that's what the statute said we had to do, and that's exactly what we did.
So this non-binding means you have to take you to court in order to object to this number, because that just adds another cost, doesn't it? So
they're not to be litigated.
They're not to be litigated.
No, there was an alternative.
How would you resolve a non-binding issue?
So one, the municipality would show what they believe their number should be, and then they would have to show how they calculated that. That would all be done through the alternative dispute resolution program that was stood up with the Administrative Office of the Courts. So the whole purpose, my understanding of the legislation, was that there was not supposed to be litigation over this, that there was supposed to be an alternative dispute resolution, so that way municipalities would not have to hire an attorney, they would not have to go through this long, arduous process. They would be able to come up with their calculations and then work that out through the court system.
Regardless, I mean, you're still going through the courts, so it's still going to cost the municipality money. I mean, you're saying it's not going to cost any money. Of course it is, because the builders are suing the towns are suing the builders. There's this massive process going on. Again, you have this obligation of these numbers that are very, very high in a part of the state where already we have very little. There are towns, I think there are 194 municipalities in our state that have zero land that it can be available for development. So we have this obligation. So you're just saying that, what do they do about that?
Well, that's statutory. So
That's what?
It's statutory. I have zero control over it. I cannot affect it. I cannot control what the calculation was supposed to be. That was all set in legislation.
So would you say that the legislation's incorrect?
No, I would say that if you
can't
would like
make
to
land
see
out of no land, I mean, right? I mean, how do you create land? Summit is 6 square miles. I have towns in my district that are 1 square mile. They have no buildable land, and yet they have these huge obligations. So my understanding is that you're allowing municipalities to shift some of those numbers to other municipalities. How would the state do that? And can you provide any relevant statutory provisions or court rulings that you believe contain this interpretation? So I know the number is fixed from fair share housing. That number is fixed. If you have to shift even, let's say, 10 of them to another place, that place still has to pick up those 10 because that number doesn't diminish. So do you have the court rulings on this issue?
But the number's not fixed. I think you might be conflating
So
previous
Commissioner, I think you're stating that and Assemblywoman, I understand what you're saying, but I think what the Commissioner is saying is that, let's just say Summit, right? I think that they then can
Conduct their own
they can
analysis.
conduct their analysis, show what it is, like that they don't have enough sufficient land or capacity or whatever it is, and then you said because it's non-binding, then does it, just so that we're all clear, does it then go to court, or what would then Summit's reprieve be after that?
Yeah,
Just if you can-
the statutory process is the alternative dispute resolution.
Okay.
Okay. And they dispute,
No, go ahead, Assemblywoman,
No,
because I
I
think
just,
it's
you know,
important, I think it's
it's
important because a
like
lot of
I-
us
you know, again, we
have
have-
similar but different issues, so,
right, we
yeah.
have, we have a huge number that is being mandated on these municipalities. You could call it what you want, but it's still high-density housing. You actually made the point that you don't want to actually change the character of the towns in which people have chosen to live. So if you take, again, I've lived in Summit for 35 years, there's a certain character of Summit, but we don't have any more buildable land. We have 0.24%. The only way to go is to go up. So is that what you're asking municipalities to do?
I'm not asking them to do anything. I merely conducted a calculation which was required by statute for me to do as the Commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs. That's what we were directed to do. I was not given the ability to create a program. I did not make this up. I did not create it in any way, shape, or form. If that's a conversation you'd like to have with your colleagues and you would like me to participate to provide some guidance as to what we've seen across the state, I will happily do that. But I just want to be very clear on this. This was not something that the Department of Community Affairs created. This was a statutory construct that we were then obligated by law to comply with.
And this complying with this law, unfortunately, we met with the DEP Commissioner last week, and we have a massive flooding issue in the state of New Jersey. And this overbuilding, if you want to call it that, or high-density housing, or taking over land that was formerly nurseries, i.e. nurseries that grow plants, now has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of apartment buildings on it. And he said it's built stronger, but it's still non-permeable, and we're having a flooding issue. So we have to be careful as a state, because what we're doing is we're addressing things in different silos, the silo of flooding and then the silo of high-density housing, or however you want to define it, and yet we're creating an issue for the state that is really a difficult issue for the people who live here. So I will change direction.
And
because-
Assemblywoman, I
Yes.
just want to let you know, because someone from staff just let us know. What they are also able to do is take what's called a vacant land adjustment. So if it's 350, let's just say the number, they can really come back with a response of this: I don't have any more vacant land. They can show proof, or they can say they have a de minimis number, right? And then that's kind of what happens in being able to show proof that I don't have any more land that is available to build this amount of units on. Correct?
Yeah.
Yes, but again, that's not, like, it's not a back and forth with the department. I
Right.
just want to be very clear on that.
Right.
That goes through the ADR process.
So what you're saying is that you are simply following statute.
Correct.
Correct. And these numbers, so again, they're going to decrease the number that you're required to build, but you're not going to eliminate that number. But you can, if you have 0% land.
That's being determined right now in the courts with the ADR at this juncture. Yeah, there's nothing, the statute did not say it must be reallocated, so that's at the discretion of ADR.
And it's my understanding that you can shift it to another municipality, is that correct?
No.
No?
That's not what the statute says, and that's not what we've stated. Again, this is all going through the court process, so that's, I think, a to be determined point, but that is not something that the department has said.
Okay, but you're saying that with the court process is not costing the municipalities money?
Well, what I'm saying is they're not obligated to hire an attorney.
How would they resolve it otherwise?
It's a mediation it's an alternative dispute resolution program. So also, just to be clear, municipalities always have attorneys on retainer, or they have their they have the municipal attorney. Most of them already have them either on retainer, or they have them as a full-time employee, number one. Number two, this is very different process. That was my understanding, again, this was done through legislation, that the point of the ADR was to eliminate having to do long litigations through builder remedies. None of these are through builder remedy issues. That was previous iterations of the calculations. So I just want to be very clear, like going forward, that was the whole purpose. It was not to have builder remedy lawsuits. It was to kind of say, this is what we're suggesting your figure should be, non-binding. If you have information to the contrary that would decrease your number, that you can conduct your own evaluation and calculation and then go through the ADR process. That's the system that was set up in the legislation. What we did with NJ Homes initiative, which is what was talked about earlier, the whole point of that was to avoid having to do the high density kinds of things. It was to engage with the communities to figure out what kind of housing stock would make sense for them. I understand what you're saying about, 300 units, but there are other places where we are also talking to them about taking existing buildings or existing housing stock and converting it to affordable housing. Not saying that all of a sudden we had to take single-family homes and make them triplexes. That's not what we were talking about. But there are ways to buy down those either mortgages or the cost to purchase them. So again, repurposing existing constructed buildings so that way we were not increasing the density.
Are you putting the same obligation on some of the places where they actually need the? You talked earlier about people don't want to live 45 minutes away from where they work. So we have obligations in the western part of the state where people have no access to public transportation, the jobs aren't out there, and yet these towns are still being obligated to build a large number of housing units. So how do you figure that out in your head, that you're telling them that you don't want to live 45, you don't want to be far away from work or where your family is, and yet you're obligating every single municipality in the state of New Jersey to build all of these houses?
So there's 2 points to that. So first, the Mount Laurel Doctrine from 1975 says that every municipality has their fair share obligation of affordable housing. So that's just what the law is. It's not the department who's saying who has to build what. Secondly, the criteria was built into this most recent legislation, A4S50. That legislation dictates what criteria we have to use for each municipality, which includes things like income limits. It includes things like how much commercial development has occurred, what the land vacancy might look like. All of those were the criteria that the legislature put into that piece of legislation that is now law that I had to use as a calculation. So it wasn't as if the department came up with the schematic as to what it was going to look like for the criteria. So I just want to be very clear on that. Those calculations are not me telling communities what they have to do. Those calculations were dictated by statute, which we had to comply with, and that's exactly why they're non-binding, because if there are other circumstances that a community knows that we, of course, would be unaware of because it's dictated in statute or the legislature was not unaware of when they were creating the statute, that was the purpose. There was some mechanism by which to utilize.
So I would suggest that they need to take a re-evaluation of the amount of land in each one of these municipalities, because we also happen to know that, like in towns like Cranford, which is no longer in my district, but they actually use the land in the median of the Garden State Parkway as land that had not been built yet. So we know you can take those numbers. I'm just suggesting that some of these numbers for some of these municipalities that are very, very already built out from hundreds of years. These towns have been around for hundreds of years. To suddenly impose this number, perhaps this needs to be reevaluated.